Today, to celebrate the release of my new Hilarious Hampers book, and to demonstrate how these hampers can be knitted on the Passap, we are going to knit the wearable tool pouch. It's on the top of the cover in the center. There it is. In total, there are 6 designs in all, and most of them have multiple sizes. This one has one size, but it has 3 gauges. As is the case with all of the patterns, it may be knitted on any machine, but demonstrating on a Passap will allow me to show you the Passap techniques that apply to many of the patterns. Here it is for size reference, worn around the neck of a size 2 to 4 dress form. Let's take a quick look at some Passap settings on this diagram of a lock, or set of locks. The lock settings are just alike, so let's zoom in on one of them so you can see better. N is what we will mostly use. It's for stockinette. In other words, plain knitting. Most of the knitting will take place on the back bed only, using it as the main bed. So the settings should be N on the back bed and GX on the front bed, so that no front bed stitches attempt to knit. For the row where we're setting up the loops that will create the pintuck, we do change to N for one row, and then change right back. Now let's look at how to do this on a Superba. In this diagram, you're looking at the back carriage with a knitting retainer inserted into it. If you own a knitting retainer, you may not have to use much weight, if any. If you do not, towards the front will be the front bed carriage, and you will definitely need substantial weights. The key marked with an upside down V is the one we use for normal knitting, otherwise known as stockinette. Where we want no possibility of knitting, use the key marked with an O. Tubular or circular knitting has a circular arrow key on both beds to indicate which you should use. When both of those are selected, one carriage will knit going one direction, one knits going the other direction. To get the tubular knitting effect on a Passap, we select C from the letter dial and X on the NX lever. And the design on Passaps and Superbas is most easily accomplished, though it is not the only way, by starting out with tubular knitting. So let's have a closer look at that. Rack the beds so that the needles will alternate, as in this photo. On both machines, the racking handle is at the lower left, although Superbas may call it the translation lever. Passap, use orange strippers to start with. Begin with a very small stitch size, usually the smallest. Set both locks or carriages for stockinette. We want both to knit. Bring 30 needles to work on each bed and knit across. We call this the zigzag row for obvious reasons. On a Superba without a knitting retainer, you must hang comb and weights now. On a Passap, you may if you have one. Change both locks or carriages to the tubular knitting and raise the stitch size a little for this row. Now rack back until the needles oppose again. It will look like this. Passaps, change to black strippers, and everyone knit 2 rows, but that's actually 2 passes of the carriages and 1 tube. Now turn the dial up to the main stitch size you intend to use on both beds. What we've actually done is knitted the first 2 of 20 rows that will be part of the initial hem. So continue until row 20 on the counter has been achieved. In fact, that's 10 complete circuits. Use a double-line needle to transfer all front bed stitches to the back bed. When this is complete, we will be done with the front bed for quite a while and can place that lock or carriage on the out-of-work setting. GX for Passap, the O key for Superbas. With the back lock or carriage still set for normal stockinette knitting, knit 50 plain rows. Rack so that the needles will alternate again. Bring up every other needle on the front bed, set the front carriage or lock to knit normally for 1 row, knit across, and you will get this. We are starting to create the pintuck that will make the top rod pocket. Now we're going to knit 20 rows on the back bed only. These front bed stitches will want to jump off unless we get firm with them, so add weights as necessary. It can also help to use a slim tool like the edge of a ruler to press down on the pocket that is forming after knitting every row. When the 20 rows for the pin tuck have been knitted, transfer all of the loops that are presently on the front bed to the back bed, and that will close the tuck. Pin tucks have a reputation for being difficult. It is not really true. Here is another look at me doing it, and I'll show you some of the pitfalls. First few rows, it's a piece of cake, helped along greatly by the fact that Passaps have strippers, and those tend to push down the stitches as you go by. But there is a pocket forming between the beds. It is starting to loosen and rise up, so I am reaching under with heel grips to hang particularly at the edges of the work. Another possibility is 7 weights. You can see one coming in from the right side, and I just worked it through the fabric, and that really helped. The pin tuck instructions begin about 4.5 minutes into this movie. The beginning is marked, and they continue for about a minute. Keep that in mind because we're going to do another one shortly. But after pin tuck number 1 and before pin tuck number 2, we just knit 30 plain rows, back bed only, front bed set not to knit. And then we do knit the second pin tuck. So let's review where we are. I changed colors for my hems. You do not have to, but it helps to point out where we are. The first pink area, pale pink, is the initial tubular hem. Then the 50 plain rows began. First, they descended towards the bottom of the pouch, then without stopping, up towards where the first pin tuck would occur, and that is the pocket that holds the hanging rod. We completed the pin tuck that makes the rod pocket, and those next 30 plain rows are working down towards the second hem, which will frame the opening. So, if you haven't already, complete one additional pin tuck just like the first. Remember, those instructions begin about 4.5 minutes into the video. Here's another way to visualize what's been happening. We cast on and knit a tubular hem because that's what Passaps and Superbas do well. The effect is very like a hung hem on a Japanese machine, but this is easier for us. Above the tubular hem, we knitted 50 plain rows. If you wanted a deeper pouch, you could certainly knit more, but be careful you don't want it dangling too low on your body. Next comes the first pin tuck, which will form the rod pocket to hold the support for the bag, some plain knitting, and we knit up to the second pin tuck, which will become the top hem. You may wonder, why make the first hem tubular and the final hem not? You could. They could be the same thing. This is just a little bit easier to achieve for the final hem, and the effect is so close to identical, it's not worth worrying about the difference. After completing the final pin tuck, transfer all the loops to the back bed as before, and then bind off. Here I'm using the transfer bind off using my fingertips instead of a tool. It works just as well for me, and I have an easier time keeping from blocking your view with fingertips than I do when I grip the tool because my fist gets in the way. With the work off of the machine, pull each pin tuck lengthwise. However, sometimes, as in the yarns that I'm using, the two areas where there was that single row of front bed stitches don't look neat enough, and they don't pull the pin tuck in tightly. In some yarns, it works to reduce the front bed stitches to the minimum stitch size for that row. These yarns didn't cooperate. They wanted to break, so I had to leave the row at main stitch size, and you might too. If yours turn out loose, as these did, we're about to make an adjustment that will solve the problem completely, so there's no reason to worry about it. Work across that row a few stitches at a time using any blunt tool to grab the yarn that constituted that row and gradually, progressively tighten it up. It only takes a minute. Sometimes you can use a few stitches at a time. Work across the row and it will be completely neat and tidy. Of course, there will be extra yarn at the far end of the row. Knot it so that it can't back out and loosen up, and tuck it inside the casing. The cast-on row that was a zigzag row might also need attention. Sometimes you simply cannot get it tight enough to be happy with it as a neat fold. If that happens, go ahead and make it larger than the smallest stitch size. Immediately hang a comb and weights, and then chain together either the zigs or the zags as a finishing technique. Well, I will restate that slightly. The yarn traveled from front to back bed. We want to grab and pull through the loops only that were either on the front or the back. Trying to get both will be overly tight and will also make the fabric flare, where grabbing one and chaining it together with the next one like it will make a nice neat chain stitch along the edge. Start at the opposite end from the yarn tail and pull the tail through the final stitch. Then pull the tail inside the casing to hide it. Finally, place the first pin tuck at the top. The two hems overlap and sew the sides of the knitting together down both sides of the pouch. But don't sew the area between the first pin tuck and the overlapped pair of hems, because that area is nifty for holding a tool. If you use a 6-inch ruler as the hanging rod and tie the yarn at one end but leave the other just wrapped, you have a ready-made measuring device that will slide out easily. My pouch is also holding a latch tool, electrical clip which will get a nice tight grip on some yarn, clothespin, transfer tools, yarn snips, and a double-line needle. A link to the Hilarious Hampers pattern book is in the program notes for this video.